How's it going, everybody? It's Tactard Ted. It is Monday, the 14th of November. How's everyone doing? And I'm sure within the last week you've seen all these glowing headlines of how the Ukrainians have captured Kherson. Yes, the first major city taken by the Russians during the special military operation is now in Ukrainian hands. But unfortunately, there are a few problems with the story, because you see in the stories, you see these very few Ukrainian soldiers surrounded by throngs of civilians. Now, the Western press, the Russian press, everybody reported that civilians were evacuated from Kherson 3 weeks ago. So who are these people? Who are these people? These are people who were brought in by the Ukrainians to make a publicity stunt. The Ukrainians are very good at publicity stunts. They're very good at propaganda. That's probably the only thing they're very good at. But they've got Kherson. Yes, they have Kherson. The Russians left. They pulled all their troops out in 72 hours without losing a man. So far, the Ukrainians who've tried to reoccupy those territories have suffered multitudes more casualties than the folks leaving. Usually that works the other way around. Usually when you're in a retreat, your rear guard suffers horrendous casualties so the rest of the army can make it away. But that's not the situation. Really, why did the Russians leave Kherson? Why did they leave it? They consider it Russian territory. Why did they leave it? Well, they left it because they're playing a long game. And I've tried to explain this to you before. What are the three priorities? Liberation of Donbass, demilitarization, and denazification. So, where does that say that we capture large swaths of ground and we fight to the bitter end over it? Doesn't say anywhere. Where does it say that we are in a battle to take territory? Well, Jay, it doesn't say that either, does it? No, in fact, a lot of that just doesn't seem to make sense. If you jive with killing the enemy and denazifying, demilitarizing, getting rid of, that's how you demilitarize, by the way. You kill the enemy, you destroy his equipment. You bloat him up, you destroy his toys, and then you ensure that he doesn't come back at you again within 10 years or so. And the Russians are doing a pretty good job of that. They're doing a pretty good job of doing it on the cheap. Now, why would the Russians want to abandon that property? Well, to be honest, it's for the preservation of their own lives and the preservation of any civilians. That's why they have evacuated the civilians of Kherson. Because the Antonovsky Bridge and the bridge over the Novokostora dam were going to be wiped out by Ukrainian attacks. Basically, once the dam was gone, the bridge was going to be gone, and a good bit of Kherson region on both banks were going to be underwater, with large losses of civilian life, and any troops left west of the Dnieper River were going to be separated. It was going to be very, very hard to supply them. So, rather than to keep tempting fate, they decided to withdraw their troops and push them to Donbass, which, if you remember, one of their big goals was the liberation of Donbass. Now, does this mean that they won't be back later? Oh, quite assuredly, they will be back. I have no doubt that they will be back. And, you know, oh, they're going to have to cross the river. No, they're not going to have to cross the river. You guys are all trapped within a box when it comes to thinking. There's a whole lot going on that you guys aren't even taking into consideration. You know, the people who are clutching their pearls and getting all upset. All one has to do is look to the northern border of Ukraine at the great amount of military equipment, both Russian and Belarusian, that are amassed on that northern border. And when the majority of the army is massed up on the front lines, another 100,000 troops coming down in your rear and driving straight to Odessa, straight to Nikolaev, straight to Kherson, that's going to be kind of hard to contend with, especially when you are suckered into a massive fight in Donbass. And everybody, you know, there's all these doubts of whether the Russians will do something that. Well, I will tell you this much. The Russians are fighting to their own standard. They're not fighting to Western standards. And apparently a lot of these Western theorists and a lot of these Western pundits are so wrapped up that everything has to be exactly like is done in the West. All one has to do is look at Syria. Syria, the Russians would not hold anything they thought was going to cost them greatly, but they would allow the enemy to come in, occupy ground that they had, and then when the time was right and the odds were in their favor, they would come back and snuff the enemy. Very simple. Use economy of force once you understand that this might be rough. And there becomes an ebb and flow in the way that the Russians fight. They're in for the long game. The number of troops that the Ukrainians have is finite. They're on their 6th or 7th call-up, where Russia simply had one call-up. And I remember the Western press just losing their shit about this call-up. Oh my God, the Russians are conscripting, which wasn't a conscription, it was a call-up of reservists. Much different than what Ukraine is doing, where they're increasingly calling up women, they're calling up granddad and little boys. This is the equivalent of World War II German Volkssturm in these call-ups. Ukraine's being bled white. And they're being brought to their knees. Now, the interesting thing is now Zelensky wants peace. No, Zelensky doesn't want peace. Zelensky wants sympathy. Zelensky wants to appear that he's looking for peace. And it's probably going to work to Zelensky's ability, because the people in the Western press and the Western people who consume the media and don't question things, the sheep, they're going to go right along with this. They're the same ones who aren't questioning why all these people are partying in Kherson when all the civilians were gone. They also won't question, if Kherson is full of civilians, why are the Ukrainian military positioning heavy weapons, tanks, artillery, that sort of thing, in the city of Kherson? Because if it's populated, then that's a war crime. Much as the Ukrainians like to do, it is a war crime. You do not place heavy weapons in and amongst a civilian population to make them targets. Yet the Ukrainians do it once and again. Now, if there are no civilians in Kherson, as the Western press has reported, as the Russian press has reported, then putting your heavy weapons there is not a war crime. But, unfortunately, the Western press is reporting that there are all these civilians welcoming the Ukrainian troops. So you can't have it both ways, folks. Either one is true or the other is true. One is true or the other is true. So either the Ukrainians are lying about being welcomed back into Kherson, or they're committing a war crime by putting their heavy weapons in Kherson. And it's also interesting, their movements are very, very small. They're very, very timid. They all believe that this is a trap, and I'm still not entirely sure that it's not a trap. I'm sure that Russian artillery, which they do artillery in a big way, has every little bit of that ground plotted, and I'm sure that every road is plotted. And anything right now that's not hardball is mush because of the autumn rains. So it's interesting to see what's going on in Kherson. It's also interesting to see how the grind forth is going in Donbass, but not being reported in the Western press. Vuhledar, however you want to pronounce it, whether you want to pronounce it Ukrainian way or the Russian way. It's about a week away. It's about a week away. Now, I know we say these things. This is about a week away. That's about a week away. And then the Russians take 3 times longer than you expect. And the Russians end up capturing the ground with limited casualties. I love how all these casualties figures about how many the Russians have lost. You know, they're so various. I will tell you this much. I don't think we've even touched the corner of the over 100,000 dead the Ukrainians have. And their dead, I guarantee you, is well over 100,000. They lost 12,000 alone in the last couple months in Kherson region, while the Russians have lost roughly about a tenth of that. About a tenth of that. So, attrition, which is what this war is a battle of attrition. You want to attrit the enemy. You want to get his numbers down. You want to demilitarize him. Borders on a map. Those come into, and the peace is when you're going to worry about the borders on the map and whatever that peace looks like. Zelensky can say everything he wants to about dealing with the Russians, but he's got conditions before they even start dealing with the Russians. One of the conditions a month ago was that Vladimir Putin could no longer be president. Well, isn't it interesting? That's went by the wayside. He needs to drop the rest of the conditions and walk to the table, because unless he walks to the table now, time's running out for him. And I've been saying this for months, and you guys think I'm full of shit. Winter is coming. Winter is coming. And once winter comes, the ground is frozen, the tanks are moving. This becomes a totally different war. It will become a different war overnight. And this may very well be the war that everybody was expecting to see back in November. A blitz, an all-out destruction of the Ukrainian military in short order. And to be honest, I don't know for certain that's the way it's going to be, but it looks like it could very easily be. Ukraine is out of armored fighting vehicles. They're out of tanks. They're very low on numbers of both. And they have very little winter equipment. The Russians, on the other hand, have a lot of winter equipment. And I really find it quite hilarious that a lot of these Western sources are saying that the Russians are unable to carry out winter operations. This is Russia, for crying out loud. They do winter like nobody else, maybe other than Canada or Norway or Sweden. They do winter. And their soldiers do winter, okay? These guys don't simply call off training in the middle of winter. It's too cold, we can't train. No, they go out and they train. They're hardy folks, man. They are hardy folks. And the other thing that I find really interesting about this bullshit in the Western press is, if you folks remember back last year in December, the Russians are going to advance any day. The Russians are going to be launching their attack any day. This shit went on for like 60 days, folks, in December. And do you know why there was no launch in December? Because the ground wasn't sufficiently frozen. They had an unusually warm year, and the ground wasn't sufficiently frozen. No, they had to wait for it to get colder before they could advance. And that's the honesty. They waited for it to get colder, and they launched their assault in the February freeze. So I really find it funny that in the West they claim that somehow a winter is going to be more of a hindrance to the Russians than it is the Ukrainians. I'll tell you what, a lot of the Ukrainian volunteers, conscripts, are going to freeze to death this winter. They're going to freeze to death. They don't have the proper equipment, or they're going to try to get warm around the fire, and they're going to find out that fire, light, draws artillery. And that's no bullshit. It will draw artillery. So I think we're getting ready to see the beginning of the end of this winter. And apparently, with the way the Russians are picking away at everything, the defense and the military is going to be an empty shell when I talk about the Ukrainian military, because it's going to be so attrited that when things are finally launched and they move forward, all it's going to take is the right pressure in the right places to crack the nut that is the Ukrainian military. Also, I hear a lot of this shit about, well, now the Ukrainians, all the troops that they had arrayed to make the assault into Kherson can now be moved. Well, yeah, they can be moved. They absolutely can be moved. There's only a couple of small problems with that. Number one, the road situation. To get to Donbass, which is where the big rumor is, where all these folks are going to be moved, to get them there, they are going to have to take a very long route up and around Zaporozhye in the middle of this soup to get there. Meanwhile, the Russians from Kherson to the areas north of Mariupol, north of Crimea, they only simply have hardball roads to run. And they have better transportation, they have better logistics, they have more trucks, more this, more that, more of everything. And for them, it's not going to be as big of a deal to redeploy the troops that they've pulled off of the western bank of the Dnieper and move them into battle, maybe around Ugledar, or maybe even on over into help secure a bridgehead up and around Donetsk city to push the folks back who've been shelling the civilians of Donetsk since 2014. I think anybody who's got any doubts as to what winter's going to mean, you might also want to look at why the Ukrainians are now suddenly wanting to talk about peace. They've got their hollow victory. They punched air. They went in, they retook a city that was abandoned by the enemy, and somehow that's a great military victory. I would say it's not a military victory for the Ukrainians as much as it is a small setback for the Russians. It's ground that they're going to have to later retake. It's ground that they're going to have to move into again later. So they're going to redeploy their troops. They're going to put them where they think they need them more for right now. And we're going to see what happens. But I would not count all those troops. And it's interesting, we're not talking much about what's going on in Belarus right now. I think it's funny, the last reports I saw were about how the Ukrainians were building a wall on the border with Belarus. They're building a wall, a border wall. Why would you build it? We know walls don't work. Listen to the Democrats here. We know the damn wall doesn't work. Wall isn't going to keep people out. But yet the Ukrainians are building a wall on their border with Belarus. And, the wall may not work with a bunch of people who want to jump the border and come invade your country and change your culture. But apparently they think it's going to work with a bunch of people with tanks and rocket launchers and all that happy shit. And I will tell you, I don't know what kind of fortifications the Ukrainians think they're building, but with the juggernaut that's in front of them, it better well be a lot better than the fucking Maginot Line. It better be better than the Siegfried Line, the Stalin Line, all these monuments to stupidity of how a line of defenses can make up for inadequate troop numbers, inadequate artillery, and just inadequacy in an area of the battlefield. I'm amazed at how many of these so-called YouTube tacticians, these YouTube experts, keep forgetting about these things. But anyhow, any border wall in northern Ukraine is about worthless. It may slow the Belarusian forces down for 45 minutes. 45 minutes, maybe less. Maybe less. I have a feeling if and when that kicks off, there's going to be a massive barrage that totally lays waste to wherever this wall is. And I do believe that you're going to see it coming soon. If not, this is one of the great holding gambits of all time. That the Russians have put this much man and material to northern sector of the border just to pin a lot of Ukrainian troops in one spot. And if you've got the Ukrainians pinned and they're on their side of the wall and they're not going to advance, well, that means when everything opens up big time, all you got to do is set on the Belarusian side of the border and shell the living daylights out of the Ukrainian positions, because they're not going to come across their own minefield wall. They don't have that kind of reserve. They don't have that kind of resolve. But we'll see. So anyhow, folks, I know I hadn't talked a lot. I've been sitting back kind of watching everything. I've been watching the press thump their chest and trumpet Zelensky, and I've been watching Zelensky run his mouth. And then I've been watching everything that's been going on everywhere else. And, I will tell you from the Russian point of view, there are a lot of people who are upset about the withdrawal from Kherson. But when it comes to the overall picture, it's going to be an inconvenience. But the Ukrainians have had that piece of property for a couple hundred years. A few months back in their hands isn't really going to matter a lot in the whole frame of things, especially not when this war ends. Anyhow, that's me. I'll talk at you later. Bye.